What is the right time to think about your product's messaging? Can positioning your product make or break it? What is the difference between products that go easy on people, landing pages that convert, and those that don't perform just as well? Today, we are going to look at some of these questions with a person who has helped hundreds of founders crack their messaging. Today, with us, we have Robert Kaminski. Robert is a partner at Fletch PMM, which helps startups position the products the way they should. Robert is extremely experienced with GTM and product marketing, having previously worked at Headway, Oracle, Four Winds Interactive, and a bunch of other companies. Welcome to the show, Robert. How are you doing today?
Thanks for having me. I'm doing great. Excited for this.
Honor and pleasure is mine. I have been having dreams of doing this for a while with folks who are expert in messaging and positioning, and I have a lot of doubts, to be honest. So this is going to look less like a podcast. This is going to look more like me taking some lessons from you. I am building my own startup, and in there we run into these scenarios where we often feel very confused. Some good things, some bad things here and there, but in general, I want to start with one very core question, Robert, for you, and we'll do the traditional style of introductions and how has your journey been, maybe when we are in the flow. But for the very first thing, can you help me understand how is positioning different from marketing? And for that matter, what makes someone good at positioning? What is a good positioning for that matter?
Sure. So yeah, a couple questions in there. I think first off, positioning different than marketing. We look at positioning more on it happens before marketing, first and foremost. It's more of the strategic answers to who exactly are we focusing on? Like, in other words, who are we going to serve? What are we going to serve them with? Like, what use cases and problems are we addressing to them? And then how does our product actually do that? Right? It's kind of the combination of those pieces. They sound like simple questions, but they're constantly moving targets, and there's really a lack of data as especially when you're an early stage startup and trying to like sort through all the potential variations of those three basic questions. And then marketing is everything that happens downstream. It's basically the execution portion of your positioning, right? And so to bring like a real example, what we see a mistake often is these teams, they go into an offsite, they get into a room, they cook up their positioning strategy, they put it into a doc, they leave the room, and they kind of just internally declare it. And sometimes they'll call in all hands and say, this is our positioning. That's great. But the actual work of executing that positioning is basically everything else the company does, and marketing falls into there. But the roadmap needs to change to prioritize that. The sales team needs to change the way they talk to customers to support that. The marketing team needs to shift all the activities, the channels that they go and talk to these folks into, the content that they're creating, and then even the way you support people. Everything aligns back to positioning. And so we see it all the time where people, they work on their strategy and they're like, I'm working on my positioning. And we usually clarify, it's like, no, you're working on your positioning strategy. The real positioning work is everything else you're going to do inside of your organization. So that's how we split those up: execution for strategy.
Well, that's like a dreamland of sorts. The product speaking the same language as the salesperson is pitching it, and then the CEO is speaking the same thing. It has never happened in my life. I have always tried making it happen, and today, even when I'm running my own company, I realize now that I'm speaking to you that it doesn't come that easy. But am I correct in saying that positioning out of all the things can make or break your company? And a follow up to that here is it takes someone to be very, very, very observant to do what you're doing. As in, you are helping people position their products, position their startups, position their businesses better. It's not an easy thing to do. It gives me goosebumps when I think about how many undefined parameters there are if it comes to positioning my own product. How has that happened? How did Robert become Robert? Like how was
Yep.
Fletch PMM born and everything in general? Why are you teaching people today how to position their products?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Like my journey, similar to a lot of folks who end up working in product and entrepreneurship in general, is very nonlinear. I actually started my career as an engineer in medical devices, so like not even in SaaS, you could call it technology, but a different technology arm. But very quickly pivoted into software and got into product consulting, learning a lot about technology commercialization in my master's. And then as I kind of went through that, I spent my first part of my career again in that consultant role. Then I moved into, I had a mentor who said like, hey, if you're really serious about entrepreneurship, go spend time in sales. And so I went and did I call it a tour of duty in sales for about 5 or 6 years as a sales engineer, account executive, and then I was running a small sales team until I pivoted into really foundationally the world of product marketing, and working on go-to-market strategies for different segments. And at that point, was part of more of a growth stage startup before joining Oracle, and then found my way back into an agency that was helping and consulting early stage startups with this until co-founding Fletch about 2 years ago with my co-founder Anthony Pieri, where we just now holistically focus on positioning and messaging for early stage B2B SaaS companies. And so for me, that journey, and I think this kind of makes up part of my worldview, is getting to look at product and go to market from all those different perspectives really helps give me a different view on how people are making certain decisions and how things work. And so that's kind of been my journey into this. And to date, we've worked with about 150 SaaS startups with Fletch. And so what we're doing foundationally, like what's behind the hood or behind the scenes and under the hood, is we've got some frameworks that we've been developing. the very first thing we developed was a value proposition framework. And this was nothing more than an observation between Anthony and I of like, does anyone know what a value prop is? And you talk to a lot of really seasoned experts that are out there, and one person calls it this, and one person it's like, oh, it's benefits and features, and there's all this language, but there was no shared terminology. And we're like, well, this is just pure art. There's no science to it at all if everyone has their own definition. And so what we've been developing over the course of like since we started is what's a foundational way of structuring a value proposition. That's the underpinning of all this. And then once we had that, we started looking at, well, okay, how are people falling into this model today, specifically in B2B SaaS? And we started to see some things that were like very eye opening. It didn't make sense to us. And the biggest one is that people are primarily messaging in the support of their positioning with outcomes, and not just outcomes, these big, bold outcomes: increase revenue, grow your customer base, like save tons of time. And what we started doing was reading thousands and thousands of startup homepages just from the angle of like, where do they fit in the model? And then could we make sense of like what their value is and who they're serving? And the crazy thing is most of the sites we look at, we couldn't figure it out. Like this, we have no idea what they do. They don't talk about their product at all. They rarely talk about their customer they're serving. They're all these bold abstract pieces. And so that really lit a fire under us of like, this feels backwards. And so we started to develop these principles about how we approach messaging and positioning. And flash forward now, we've taken all these companies through our model, and now we have a really good sense. You talk about like, how do we guide these companies? A lot of it's pattern matching, but a good portion of it also is just laying out clearly what's really happening behind the scenes. And it's interesting where we started this conversation because you brought up difference between marketing and positioning. Those collide directly when we're running sessions with these founders. And they often conflate like what's working in marketing and all these tactics with these bigger questions that they haven't answered around positioning. And so we're able to separate those things, lay out what is really happening, and we call it like positioning options. And there's like, who are the different target audiences? What are the different use cases? What are the different components of the product? And we throw these on a canvas, and it's like a visual canvas of like, here's what's really happening behind the scenes. And here's usually why you're having a lot of trouble executing your marketing, because these puzzle pieces aren't put together correctly. And so it gives you a little glimpse into like my path and then even our journey so far with Fletch, and feel free, we can double click in on any of that, but that's a good start point.
Yeah, I already have a follow up. So you talked about value proposition, and that value prop. I remember in the first company that I was working for, Sprinkler, we had this product business use case, sort of a value framework matrix, wherein we had, I think, about 12 cross 3, which is 36 use cases which were being targeted to different personas, and it was all brilliant. And
Wow.
it was so intense that at some point of time, if you just go in and ask a product manager who's serving a product saying, hey, what's your value prop number 24, they would not know it, because 36 is like a big number to keep an account of.
Yeah.
So is there like a good practice in general about specifically startups, because it's very easy to feel, hey, let's add 10 more features and cater to 10 more personas, but that's probably a recipe for disaster. Is there like any guideline in general? That was like the first thought that came to my mind. Is there a cap to how many
Yes.
value? Yeah.
It's such a great question, and I love that you shared a story, because that scenario is loosely the scenario we're dealing with when people show up at our front door and are like, help me with my positioning. When you're an early stage startup, so our belief, right, good product marketing for early stage really comes down to being really specific. It's really clarity, and the only way you can get to clarity is being really specific on the who, really specific on the use case, and really specific on what they'd actually do with the product. And so our guiding approach, effectively one way to look at our service, is we're trying to help them find the right repeatable beachhead market. And so you ask, like, is there a benchmark or a number? We're trying to get them down to one. Like, what is the tip of the spear use case and the tip of the spear customer segment and who you're serving? And in B2B, that's usually some combination of industry and team. Sometimes it's technology stack. Sometimes it's even like brings in problem. There's a lot of different criteria you can bring in. And then can you bring that focus as a way to repeatedly earn conversations and get in front of your ideal customer? When you have a scenario where there's 30 use cases, the view of that, the product marketer's view from a go-to-market, is that those are 30 plus markets. It's actually much more than 30, because there's different flavors of that use case that cut across different industries and different roles. And so I always like I can always tell when a startup is totally screwed or having a hard time with their positioning and their marketing and messaging. I go to their site, I check a couple things. I go to their site nav, and usually there's a drop down that says solutions, and I take note of, oh, that many industries, this many use cases. I just did one the other day. I think they had 10 industries. There's like 5 different tech stacks, and then there was like 6 use cases. And I look at that, I'm like, oh, okay. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but then I check, I guess there's technically 2 other things. I go check how much money they've raised. And it's like, okay, they've raised 5 million, maybe 10 million. And then I go look at their team size, specifically their go-to-market and marketing team. And it's always 5 people. It's like 2 AEs, 3 AEs, and a marketer, and then like a consultant or a halftime person. And I look at that, and I already know they're screwed, because when it goes back to like all those numbers, when you multiply them up, I see go-to-market programs. Like, how do you turn those on? And when you have dozens of go-to-market programs and a team of 1.5 marketers and 2 sales reps, you cannot turn on repeatable marketing. You just can't. It's like the logic is not there. If you break down what do these teams do when they show up for work on Monday, they just will not have the critical mass of content, of insight, of spending time with the customer, of creating all these assets to support sales, like everything you need to get this repeatable motion. So that's the tool right there, that story we use when people are saying, no, but we have some traction across all these use cases. Traction is different than scalable go to market. It's just they're totally opposite ends of the spectrum. And so we tell them, like, you can stay broad. You're going to grow a lot like a full service agency where it's like really low volume word of mouth. And then your internal operation it's going to be one of the hardest businesses to run, and it flat out doesn't scale. And so
Yeah.
like that's in turn back to your core question of benchmark, find the beachhead. And we hear all these funny things like we hear this phrase we hear all the time. I'm focusing on 3 or 4 ICPs. And we just like pause, like just look at the logic of that sentence. You can't focus on 4 things. You just can't.
Yeah.
And so we try and pull back the logic and really get these founders, because we work primarily with early stage, like seed, series A. But we've worked with kind of the whole spectrum, but that's the primary. The biggest constraint they have is resources, right? And the ones that get it, recognize that and lean into it and see it as a competitive advantage. The ones that don't, they swim in ambiguity and they have a really hard time with their marketing and they have a really hard time explaining their product. And those are some of the factors that fold into that.
Hey everyone, welcome to Just Crunch It. Here we talk about all things data, analytics, business, AI, and everything in between. Some very hard questions, some very honest answers. This is for you if you are an expert or if you are just getting started with a career in data and data science. This is for you if you're feeling left behind in today's world of AI and the ever-evolving technology landscape. I love how you map it to the number of GTM motions you can have. That's a lens that most people ignore. Like the consensus, or whenever I talked about ICP and so on, it's always with the lens of, oh, it's an early stage company. But if an early stage company has hit a certain milestone, they have a certain number of people, maybe it's okay to have 2 or 3 ICPs as well, if you can
Yeah.
like do justice to doing that. And okay, but I have one more thought in my head, and this one again resonates with something that I have personally gone through. So I am building Crunch, and at Crunch, as is the case with everyone, you initially have like this whole open-handed theory of who you're going to go after. You talk to people, you realize you start getting some clarity, there's still some ambiguity. So what we ended up doing was we just went and said, hey, we are going to go in and say that we build AI agents. And I see this very commonly happening today, specifically with the number of AI solutions that has popped up in the last 1 year. There is a Copilot for everything. Like I don't know if you probably go in and search Copilot for horse riding, you'd probably still get a solution, something which is saying that, okay, yes, it helps you with that. So what I didn't realize back then was that the minute I say Copilot for X or an AI agent, I'm being bracketed in the category of tools that are all copilots or AI agents. And it took me some time before realizing that, okay, I would go in saying that I'm an AI agent and the world has already worked against me. People have judged me for what my product is likely going to do. And the minute I go in and start explaining, they're having tons of questions because of the really bad experiences they have had with previous copilots that they have seen. So that got me thinking about, okay, what is the right word to use, right? Like I know I want to use only one word. And it's very tough coming to that one phrase that resonates the best with people, which also does justice to what you're trying to do. And this is all after having done the market research. This is all after having done the market discovery. So my question here is that oftentimes using a terminology that is very common harms people more than it helps. And with the advancement of AI and all of these things, wherein there is a copilot for X or X for Y, hundreds of them, how do you think people can get their positioning right? Like this doesn't have to be about me, but I remember this in context of this book, obviously awesome. In here, there is a concept of cake pop, and it's a brilliant example. So, therein, the author she goes and says that, hey, you so this person is trying to sell a cake, and this cake automatically starts getting compared with all the other cakes. So you have these shops that are cake shops, you have these pastries, and people start bracketing you in that category. But then the person who's building it, they wanted it to be something that is on the go. So you want to eat like cake, but you're not like necessarily sitting in a restaurant and eating it on a plate. So they just go in and say it would be cake on a stick, right? Like, and the minute they say cake on a stick, now there is a visual representation of actually a cake piece sitting on a stick, an ugly looking stick. And that is where she goes and says, the minute you say stick, then again, people are like actually comparing it with whatever they have seen on a stick, right? Like, which is usually you have these barbecue pieces on a stick or something like that. And it's still not communicating what you're really trying to do. And then someone goes and says, so, oh, you're trying to do a cake, but you want it to be on the go, pretty much like these coffee cups, which are on the go and so on. Why don't you use the term cake pop? And immediately now you are going and appealing to people who understand what a lollipop is. And then there is a cake and so on. So I don't want to preach to the Pope here, but that was the first time when I read that, I was like, okay, wow. So how many founders even question when they're writing the first line, that hero header on their landing page, and they go in and say, we sell cakes? Are they even considering the fact that by just mentioning that they are now competing with everyone who is a cake player, whether in their heads they were actually trying to do a cake pop, they are unfortunately competing against cake. So coming back to the core question, how can people get their positioning right? Like even identifying that one value prop is like part of the problem solved. It's still a long way between like using the right terminologies and so on.
Yeah. So there's a couple things in here that we should talk about. When we think about categories, and really with any kind of verbiage, but categories in particular, they are reference points. Right? And this is the way we look at positioning quite a bit. And we in our model, we have what we call positioning anchors. And it's finding the right reference points to hang your hat on for people to quickly understand you. Because categories, they're like heuristics, right? They are just like in a phrase, people can understand a little bit of like, okay, I think I get what they're doing. As it relates to the competition piece, right? Who am I competing with when I use these certain categories? What this really comes back to is it comes back to the who, right? Because it's perception. And this is what gets really interesting for companies, especially companies that grow and move into adjacent markets, because the very same product can start to fall into all these different categories. I did a breakdown for Jasper AI maybe over a year ago now, and actually I'm not up to speed on what they're doing today. But even on their homepage, I think they listed 7 or 8 categories. It was like AI blog writer, AI content assistant. It's like AI for marketing teams, and there was a whole slew of them. It was like copywriter in a box. Like it was like all these different things. You have to realize that it's almost like the beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Well, perception of what your product is in the eye of the beholder. And so if we use this cake pop analogy, right? When you what was the first one you said? It was cake. It was just cake,
Cake, just
straight up
cake.
cake,
Yeah. Yeah.
just cake. You then have to start to think about like, well, who's eating cake, right? And the different, and again, it's a consumer model, but B2B would be the same thing. It's like, well, maybe people who are buying wedding cakes, people who go into coffee shops, like, and like it starts to paint this picture of people enjoying this like delicate dessert, right? And it's like they're not on the go. It's like they're sitting down. It's usually to some special occasion, a birthday, wedding, like I said. And then you move into cake on a stick, right? And it's like on a stick. Like, well, who would understand that? What do you think of? And you brought these up. It's like, well, I'm at a carnival, maybe I'm at a barbecue. It starts to place the who, right? And
Yeah.
then when you talk about on the go and they move into cake pop, you're talking about lollipops, which are literally like little kids. You're now in a candy bucket almost that you're competing with, right?
Yeah.
And so all of this comes back to if I was that bakery, and thinking through how do I actually approach messaging this thing? There's a decision in there, and it's like, who am I trying to sell this to? Am I trying to sell this to the bride for her wedding? Because that's an angle where I might lean into cake and try and make it more elegant, like a more elegant cake, that does these things. Am I trying to sell it to the party, the big like festival people that are putting things together? I would come in at that middle one with like the on a stick. Or am I thinking more commercial? I want these things to be sitting at the counter of like convenience stores. Like then I think about a cake pop. And going back, you brought up April Dunford. What's really good about her model, and there's a catch to it, and she even calls this out and recognizes it. Is she taught one of the first questions she asks is like, what would your customers do if you didn't exist? Like, what would they use? But it forces you, like in there is baked in, who the heck are you building for, right? Your
Yeah.
customers. And the tricky thing is that especially when we're talking with startups, is they actually really do one thing really bad. They try and summarize all those people, and they would say something like dessert eaters, right? Or like dessert and
Yeah.
candy eaters to capsulize all three, and then they're stuck because it's too broad of a segment, right? And this goes back to specificity. And so it's a recognition that when you pick a different who and or when you pick a different alternative, you're talking to a whole new set of people that requires a different message. And so if we boil this all the way back even into like positioning and then messaging and like what you would say in marketing, and this is really our value proposition model. A value proposition should label what you're replacing, right? And so in this example of the 3 types of positioning for this cake pop thing, you would make the argument very differently, right? You would say, oh, you're like, and so the first part of the value prop in
Yeah.
our framework is like, oh, you've had a big piece of cake. It's delicious, but it doesn't really travel well. It's really messy. You need napkins. They're a little bit more expensive. Introducing, our thing, it's cheaper, less messy, and you don't need napkins, right? Then you move into the next one where you're like, oh, you're having chicken on a skewer, and it's like, that's great, but like, it's only savory, right? And this is usually walking around, you've already eaten dinner, and like, you want something that's like a little bit more feels like dessert. It's like intro, our on a stick product. And now suddenly we're arguing against, and like, we're pointing out the value between those 2 gaps. And then obviously the third one is the same thing. It's like, you had lollipops and all this, but it's like, you've had those for years and they're getting boring and they're all the same flavors. And it's like the texture is really slimy, whatever you want to argue it. And then you intro the cake where it's like, oh, I feel like you're getting something special in the way that this is delivered. And so 3 different value props, 3 different positionings for 3 different people. And so it's like, it's just coming back and recognizing that those are decisions in relation to the reference point and the category you're choosing. My closing on that would be, if you're a startup, use the category that it brings the most clarity, right? Worry about, especially when you're figuring things out, worry about the competitive piece later after people understand your product. And so we encourage folks that are really early on that are seeking the right fit, just make sure people can like picture the product, like you said, once there's a visual to it, and then see what they say, and then use that as a guide to tune the positioning and messaging as you go.
So I want to double down on it. So one thing is very clear, the who, but I'm also saying the other side of it, which is the competition. How do you stand out in front of them? Which may be an attempt at like differentiating yourself. So are you saying that differentiation also affects positioning, but that should only come in after the who part has been really solved for. And to that, like the way I got thinking about this is sometimes if you are building a CRM tool, the best way to actually position yourself is a CRM tool. You don't actually have to go on and be overly competitive about, oh, we are a whatever table that does XYZ. So
Yeah.
am
So
I
there's a
am I
couple
getting
things.
it right?
If I
Yeah.
could jump in here, yeah, there's a few things here that are really, this is a really interesting conversation. The So we think differentiation is baked into positioning and how you approach things, right? So like you solve for it in the way that you articulate how you're competing against these alternatives and who you're for. It's kind of like where we think differentiation lies. There's a couple variables though that we have to consider. First one, market maturity. So if you're in a really mature market, or you're thinking about entering into a mature market, the cake pop example, the CRM example, everyone knows what a lollipop is. Everyone knows what a cake is. And maybe the screw on a stick. I guess you can call it maybe mature. Maybe that's a little bit more emerging, but we'll put that
Yeah.
aside. When you're going into an emerging category, you're almost always, as you said, going to have to reference the category. And if it's really mature, like CRM, you usually have to reference the specific competitor because the space is so saturated, right? And so if you're CRM that's thinking about going after like really again any part of B2B, I suppose, which is like CRMs in general, you better label why you're better than HubSpot or why you're better than Salesforce, depending on who you're going after. Because if you don't, it's the 800-pound gorilla in the room that's unaddressed,
Yeah.
where your positioning of like, hey, and we would call this other side that I'm about to describe as contextual positioning. It's like, yeah, it's really hard to keep track of all your clients and like how to follow up. It's like, yeah, you're describing the situation where a CRM is already like the de facto gold standard. So mature category, your positioning and differentiation is usually going to be competitive to some degree. And ideally there's some nuance or niche down of like who you're focusing on. In emerging categories, that's where that contextual works much, much better. And this is where I think a lot of the AI companies are trying to figure this out today, but they don't know the best use cases. And it's where you're really labeling really a set of like circumstances. It's like, well, you're cobbling together a couple tools to do this, but what you're really trying to do is carry out this one activity and it's not really working. And you're almost doing a version of category creation in a way, but it's not category creation in the way where you're pulling it out of left air and like, oh, you need this thing. You're trying to connect the dots to current situation and a specific activity they're doing and being like, this is the thing that you need to keep pushing forward. And we call it X. And that's where you start to hear things like, the fancy new categories that aren't really categories yet. There's another piece of this too. So market maturity, really important when considering positioning. The other thing is just being, and this is really important, I think, for the audience, like building AI. There are some founders that build what we would say market first. A lot
Mm-hmm.
of times they're subject matter experts or they have a problem themselves and they're out to solve it. We say market
Yeah.
first because they know who they're serving. They felt the pain, they see the pain, they interact with it all day, and then they say, we can do better. Let's go build
Yeah.
something to address this. Personally, I think that's a better way to build startups and businesses, like because the market's there and you're now just plugging in a solution to effectively your distribution and your connection to the market. All these AI tools that are popping up are almost all doing the opposite. New technology comes out, generative AI, OpenAI, ChatGPT 3.4, all this stuff. It's a technology, right? It's kind of like it doesn't tell you, there's no market in it, right? This is the pieces that people are trying to figure out. And so in this scenario, you have this technology where everyone's like, this is freaking cool, and people are building stuff with it. Emphasis on the how abstract stuff is, and that's what you're seeing really across everything now. Is like all this experimentation, and what people are doing is saying, wow, that was really cool. Did you see how it created that 1,000-word thing in like 10 seconds? Like it's kind of like a blog post. Like we should go point this at people who write blogs. And so they are a technology that are sort of shaping a product and trying to point and discover a new market. That's when you're doing that, and there's some folks who come to us, and we work with a lot of AI companies. If you don't know the use case, which I would say the majority don't today, the best thing you can do from a positioning piece, and it's kind of like not positioning, is just clearly explain how you think your product works and point it, excuse me, in the vague direction of where you think the market is, and then start listening for signal in all these different pieces. But you eventually will have to make a choice of what your use case is, because that's like the market you're going to go after. And so I'll pause there. This gets into a lot of things of like how technologies get adopted. Jeffrey Moore writes a lot about crossing the chasm, or like that first part of like, here's this cool technology, I've shaped it into this product. You're really going to find visionaries first before you move to the pragmatists. And so maybe we double click there, but what does that trigger on your end? There's a couple things in there.
Yeah. No, so I'm as you're talking about everything, I'm sort of like going through my own journey in my head in terms of where we are, what we are trying to do, how all of these broadcasting and messaging that we do. And
Yeah.
time after time, I think like where most founders falter is that they end up losing patience. And I don't mean it in the general way, as in sometimes when you're trying to do products which are broad in their offering. For example, we ourselves, and I'm not necessarily trying to plug my own startup here, but we serve analysts, and analysts report to the revenue operation, the finance team, they report to the product team, the growth team, the data team. And sometimes it just takes a lot of time trying to figure out, okay, here is the right person, because all of these people have respective budget owners. and you have to figure out what is that messaging that is resonating with them. And if you're trying to do it for 5 verticals, and then there are different seniority levels, and that's also a very high level complexity, like as in if you go granular, you have a lot many things that come up. Sometimes we are so focused on it that we just lose sight of the fact that, okay, it's okay to spend 3 more months figuring out who resonates most with it, like broadcast it loosely and see who's or what signals you're getting. So that point stuck very, very, very well with me. But Robert, I'm almost thinking like, when I say examples of good positioning, who do you think of in an early stage company? Like, do you
Yeah.
it could be someone you've worked with, could be someone you've not worked with, but can you
Yeah.
think like who comes to your mind when I say, wow, that's brilliantly positioned? And of course, I think like
Yeah.
we know of companies like Apple and so on, and established ones, but I would love to hear some bigger names as well.
For sure. Yeah, I'll share examples. A couple we worked with, a couple we haven't. It's important to keep in mind, like good product marketing, good positioning, it's always a moving target, right? And so
Mhm.
in some ways when you say like who was brilliantly positioned, you're kind of saying like who found product market fit, and you basically just go down the list of like who had success, right? And so we look at it a little differently, right? If we're just measuring like if I'm starting to look at a company, really understanding like are they doing good product marketing, are they approaching positioning in a way that makes sense, knowing that there's variety, right? There's no one perfect way to position any company. There's a lot of routes people can take. One company that comes front of mind that I bumped into, and so not one we worked with, but I thought was kind of brilliant in how they're thinking through the way we think about it, is a company called actually I got to pull it up now. I forgot. Collective. So Collective, they've recently raised a bunch of money, but and I think they brought in a little bit. But when I came across them, they basically offer a solution for solopreneurs where they handle the taxes. Really big pain point.
Mhm.
I'm
Mhm.
I fit into that boat, even though it's a partnership between Anthony and I. You know, we have a really small team over here. Very similar scenario. We're like, and we did have to solve like how do we do our taxes? How do we structure our, our corporation? All these different things. And we were introduced to them through a copywriter. Her name's Kate. She's actually kind of like our staff product marketer and does a lot of our copywriting on our projects. And she was like using them for her, the way she structures her business. And she's like, oh, you should see these guys. But she asked the question. She onboarded with them. She's a solopreneur. And she said, oh, this is great. She's like, hey, I've got this other company I work with. That's like a 2-3 person company. Like, I think they're perfect for this. And they told her, no, they're not a good fit. And so to me, we're like, even
Yeah.
if we wanted to, Collective wouldn't take us on as a customer, right? And this shows up in their messaging too, is like they are very precise and very aggressive on who they serve and what they're doing for them, right? And they ignore everything else, right? Because it's just shiny things. Could they go expand and do small businesses with 2 or 3 owners? Sure. But it's going to break their product, it's going to break their marketing a little bit, and they probably will eventually expand into that. And so that was one piece where it's like, to me, when I look at early stage product marketing, it really comes back to like being really dogmatic and specific so that you can be clear of who you're serving, what the hell you do to serve them, like what are they actually going to do with the product and what's the use case. And so Collective was one that really hit me. There's 2 others. We actually worked with these folks. One of them is North One, who's run by a fantastic founder, Aitan. And Aitan, apologies, I'm actually forgetting your last name. But and they're a little further along, right? So North One, I think they're Series B plus. They serve a multitude of segments. For a little bit of context, they're sort of like Ramp, where they
Mhm.
offer this company level credit cards and like financial infrastructure type of deal.
Yeah.
And the reason why I say they're a great example of good product marketing, good positioning, is that in working with Aitan, the one thing that they're starting to live out, kind of going back to the first part of like product marketing, sales, all these things, is they have recognized how fragmented their customers really are. So initially, when we were talking to them, they serve small businesses, whereas Ramp's a little bit more larger businesses. They have a small
Mhm.
business product, but North One, small businesses like banking, kind of banking credit cards for small businesses. And what they found as we started working with them is like there's really these like 3 or 4 segments that they have the most customers. And if memory serves, it was like independent truck drivers, independent beauty salons, and 1 or 2 others. And what they realized is that even for those different segments, we'll take the truckers and the beauty parlor owners, they have very different needs and use cases when it comes to a company credit card and things that they're bumping into related to cash flow and how they keep track of things. And so what's brilliant is the way that they're approaching it is they are basically breaking down their positioning, and they now have a team that's big enough to do this, and they are sub positioning for beauty salon owners, and they're sub positioning for these independent truck drivers. And not only are they marketing to them in different ways, but they are adapting the way that they even come into the product and use the product. Basically, they introduce different features in different ways to meet their specificity. So to me, that is amazing product marketing. It's an amazing recognition of how fragmented markets really are. And so that was a really good one. And then this last one here, and it's and maybe there's another one I can get into, but this one maybe will hit home a little bit, is a company. The company's called No Code Ops, but they have this new product they're launching called Operator. And what I love about them is this founder, they started market first as a way to build this solution where they already knew that this problem existed. And their whole solution is geared around enterprise scenarios for folks who are using no code. And their whole product is built around maintaining no code implementations. And so keeping track of everything, like what are we doing in Zapier? What are we doing in Airtable? And all these things, because right now they're getting tracked in a spreadsheet. And so they built their whole product to do that. And they're building a community to go with it. And so again, another example, like really focused, really clear. And so those are some of the ones that come to mind. And then as we get into it, I have an AI example that we could probably knife into, but I'll pause there for a moment.
Yeah. No. So I'm wondering if this is because these companies have reached a certain scale, As in when you are early stage, when you're trying to figure out, is it best to like just keep your positioning loosely held? As in if someone is trying to
Great
compete with,
question.
let's say that they're trying to build their own ramp, maybe you don't want to cater, or for that matter, the solopreneur example that you want to give, like that you gave, if someone is like actually going to compete with them, maybe it's not a good idea to actually go only after solopreneurs because there's already someone operating in there. So how do you recommend founders take care of that?
Yeah, so a couple things. Those two examples actually, they're pretty further along, and so that
Yeah.
positioning now is representing like their growth stage positioning. Um, when you ask the question of should my positioning be broad, when you're really early, yes, like really early. We call that experimentation positioning. Sometimes we'll call it minimum viable positioning, where you're not really defining the who. You're abstractly saying like, oh, people who struggle with like this problem, and what you're doing there is you're really listening for signals, initial signals. The challenge is that's that positioning isn't really going to help. It might what you're going to find in that positioning are those early adopters, almost people that seek you out and they see what you're doing and they're like, "That's interesting. I need to talk to these folks." The majority of the market's not going to do that, and so it's a great place to start. But as quickly as possible, you need to get specific, right? There's this, and this is probably the hardest thing for founders. Jeffrey Moore talks about this in his book Crossing the Chasm. He refers to it to like picking a beachhead and very similar terminology or at least approaches. You have to pick because if you can't live in that broad place, and there's this flawed assumption that founders think the data will tell us that we'll stay
Yeah.
broad and then it's just going to jump out at us, and there's some truth to it, but it's really small. Like you'll get signals, but the data's not going to tell you. The data's not going to be explicit. In fact, the data's going to make it harder because it's going to be even more unclear, right?
Yeah.
This is where qualitative insight and point of view and recognition of trends and all these things, like as a founder, you have to have an intuition about where the market's going and who you should be building for and where there's going to be best fit. And then you need to push that into the market, right? Markets don't just abstractly shape, they react to that pressure from founders putting new things out into the wild. That's the only way you'll really know. And there's this, the last thing I'll say on this bit in particular is like, the thinking is let's spend a lot of time trying to figure out the perfect use case. That's flawed. It, the
Yeah.
time you're spending there, you're far better off just picking and then using the better insight from picking and seeing how the market reacts to course correct. And so it's
Yeah.
like it's so funny. These teams spend months positioning, and we look at them. We're like, hey, this whole thing, like, you guys already know a lot. Like, you could position yourself in a day. You're just too afraid to make the decision, and they think data is going to save them. And so the long and short is, you can do the broad thing for a little while. It's not a way to build a go-to-market program. It's more of a research positioning, if you will, so that you can really quickly get specific and then actually test your go-to-market and your fit with who you're trying to serve.
Love that viewpoint on the market reacting to the pressure that founders bring. But I can 100% attest to the data doesn't help. Like you can have 20 customers and they are all early adopters and they're using your product, but because you were too broad, they're all from 7 different verticals. And now you still don't know whether it's going to be the CRO in this particular industry that you're going to target. So at that point of time, you just
Yeah.
take a call, depending on who is probably out of these 20, who was the easiest to convince to pay you. And that might be a mistake. So I have thought about it myself. Robert, a flip down onto everything we've been talking about for established company, and this is very relevant because on the ground in the SFP area, I'm talking to a lot of leaders, data heads, chief revenue officers, even these like incumbent players, or let's say non-digitally native, like non-SaaS companies, which have like massive, massive, massive operations, the Walmarts and Macy's of the world, and likewise, there's like this unsaid, uh, common unsaid feeling of being left behind. There is this desperate attempt of positioning themselves as like a tech friendly company, or because there's this realization that okay, even if this AI wave or whatever it is, you have not adopted it so far, not adopting it 2 years later is probably going to have a massive cost on your business. It's going to probably become a competitive disadvantage. So to all of these established people who are now thinking of changing their image in front of the world, does like how does that exercise look like? What happens when you are a massive organ, you're trying to change your position?
Yeah. My point of view on this is that most of those executives at those large companies, and I've interacted with quite a few of them, spending spending some time at Oracle and consulting with folks who are thinking about how do I continually digitally transform and all these things. Their biggest roadblock, they are thinking about it in too big of a manner. They think that they need to take their whole org and bring AI into the whole org. That's so flawed. it, you can't do even bringing a new digital technology and implementing it in the org. Even that's pulling teeth and takes 18 months, right? And so they get this. They actually like psych themselves out of like you said, we're left behind. Like we got to do these big things. And I've consulted with a lot of these corporate innovation labs as well. They need to think like a startup. They need to think in terms of small bets, right? And so if I'm an executive at Macy's, I'm not thinking about how does like my whole company run on AI. What I am doing though is I'm putting aside resources, dedicated resources that have their own space in an innovation lab of sorts, and I'm kind of keeping them away from the core business. They can be adjacently touched, but I don't want any wires attached, right? I don't want them in charge of any revenue metrics or anything. I want them over here thinking through small scenarios, like what part of our business do we think AI is going to impact the most? And then as they develop this list, and there will be a list of things, then they think like a founder, right? And like MVP approach is still a very viable thing that I think people still overlook. It's like, what's the smallest thing we could do? And what they don't realize is they have a huge advantage because they have access, they have distribution built into all the market. They're like
Yeah.
market leaders in all these spaces. And so they don't have to roll it out to 100% of their market. Take 1 or 2% of the market that creates this nice little like slice and go put a new AI product in front of them. And if you're really worried about risk and pushback, call it something different. Don't call it Macy's, call it I don't know, M Labs, and just like don't even affiliate it with the brand, but and just say, oh, we're doing a pilot with Macy's in this piece to start to gauge people. And so it's like it's a whale of a transformational technology that is going to change a lot of businesses. You don't devour a whale in one bite, right? And so that'd be my biggest advice to the folks who are doing this. And if I even add this on to founders, same thing. Stop trying to transform entire markets and businesses. My thesis on AI is really vertical SaaS and fragmented SaaS. I think software development and AI is now powering this means that people who previously couldn't build their own like dedicated solutions from a software perspective can now build them pretty easily. The cost of good product and software development is going to zero. And so I think the big winners that come out of this AI piece, they're definitely the ones that solve for those use cases. To take that even further, they're the ones that are going to solve for the most specific use cases. And I think a lot of them are going to be very unsexy. I think they're going to be super small. And I think then naturally what you'll see as those get adopted is there'll be, some way, shape, or form of like people buying up all these pieces and stitching them into big solutions. But the big winners of AI, vertical, like, and I see some great examples that are already becoming huge businesses, like the ones that are like, we're just going to write leasing contracts for lawyers in commercial real estate. It's like, you look at that market's small, but the businesses that are in them booming, and then they can branch out, right? They use the success of the first wave to go. And so, that's kind of my view on how I think AI is going to get rolled out corporate and startup wise.
What was that AI company you were about to mention whose positioning you really like? I'm curious.
Yeah, so I think it's a good example just for the audience today to talk through. I think it's a really good connection back to experimentation positioning and then getting really specific and actually positioning. And I think they're relevant to what you're doing to some degree. It's a company called Levity, a really cool company. I believe they've raised a series seed, like, I don't know, $5 or $10 million. They basically have built a Zapier style no code for building AI. So like it's like a building blocks of AI. It's like they build AI workflows, and their angle is that they want to automate things that Zapier can't automate. And so it's more along the lines of like when a human comes in to do something, can I no code come up with a way? And it was interesting when we were working with them, is they had this issue. Well, who is this for? And it's like tech savvy people trying to automate things. It's like, yeah, that's not good enough. Huge list of use cases. And so what we ended up doing with them is, because one of the outputs of our process is a homepage, is we wrote the homepage with like really without any positioning. And it's basically, we build AI workflows in a no code way to automate things that Zapier doesn't. And then we introduce how it works. It's like, there's these 4 building blocks. You use them to string together these workflows, and then you test them and you publish them and connect them to other apps. And that's basically like the explainer. But what we told them and what they eventually adopted is like, they need to make a bet on who this is for and the use case. And so their bet was the use case is going to be managing a company inbox, so a shared inbox for a company that gets a ton of inbound queries for sales and support. And the reason they did this, initial signals, right, of the early adopters they had that with traction, they found a lot of people are doing it to like better organize these like really messy email accounts that are shared across people. And so we built a whole positioning around that and a whole separate page. And that's going to be their tip of the spear of experimentation. It's kind of their thesis of like where we can get really specific. And that's it. I bring it up too for a lot of the folks, and it sounds like you're in a very similar scenario, is like, it's really scary to do that. And so the founder, I give him a bunch of credit, is like, he had really good self-awareness to know this is scary. I'm basically shrinking down my entire vision to become an email automation tool. And this gets into categories again. When you get that specific, I wouldn't call yourself an AI workflow builder anymore. Yeah. You are a premium ultimate email automation for companies with really messy inboxes that are shared by people, because then people will get it. The AI doesn't matter. It's just the technology. It's the feature that supports all these capabilities. And so that was one that hopefully hits home with folks. And it's like the takeaway there is like, sure, you can be broad in product, but don't be broad in go-to-market and positioning, because that's where like the rubber actually meets the road.
Yeah, no, I am sure. And I resonate a lot with what you were just mentioning. Robert, I wish we could do this for longer. We're out of time, so I'm going to bring my 3 quick questions, as in like you can have very, very, very smart answers for them. Anything in general that you're excited about? 1, 2, any learning that you would want to give everyone who's listening in today? And 3rd, where can people reach out to you?
Excited about. I get really excited when I see early stage founders building their market distribution first. And so my example of that is I see a ton more founders that are recognizing that by building and fostering a community of people that listen to their ideas, the building of the product and scaling the product is going to get a hell of a lot easier. And so market first instead of just product and then spray and pray. That gets me really, really excited because I think that's a better way to build. What was the second question?
Question number 2 was any closing thoughts that you'd want to leave everyone here?
No closing thoughts. We covered so much. I hope it was insightful. I would ask anyone who listened, like, come find me on LinkedIn. We're super active there. Send me a connection request. We accept everybody. Shoot me a DM with specific questions that you have. That's another piece that even folds into the learning question is like, that's our way of sticking our head directly into the market that we serve. And so my encouragement to other founders out there is like, work on your product, sure, but find a way to spend hours and hours with your customers every single day because it's a great way to de-risk what you're working on.
Yes. And the only thing I would add to that is at some point of time, make sure you don't end up into analysis paralysis, as in like just take that leap of faith. I have spent time on that. And there's this book called Screw It, Let's Do It by Richard Branson, the founder of Virgin Airlines. It's a lovely book, gave me goosebumps. I remember when I was a kid, I read it. I didn't sleep for a couple of nights. And
wow,
there are these instances where I just go ahead and say, hey, screw it, we're going to do it. Like, right, like there's not clarity. Like, you have to take a position. What you were just talking about, the founder needs to have that viewpoint. Well, it was a blast, Robert. I thoroughly enjoyed our chat. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. Me too. I had so much fun, and we'll have to do this again sometime soon.
Yes, we should. And dear listeners, if you like what you saw, please let us know. We will see you with newer episodes and equally interesting topics every week. Until next time, bye-bye.